When I started doing this with my sourdough starter, I stopped having to go through tons of flour and a very regimented of having to feed it all the time and feeling like I was on the clock to make sure my sourdough starter was fed. Using this method, I only have to feed my sourdough starter once a week, sometimes even 2 weeks or 3 weeks, depending on when I'm baking. So I'm not going through very much flour, and my sourdough starter is always ready to go. So this works with an established starter. We'll talk about that in a minute. So I keep my starter in the fridge, and I simply only this much. So this is actually a little bit less than a cup of starter. So I'm actually going to take out what I've got here because I'm going to use this in a recipe later this afternoon. So I'm going to set this aside. So therefore none of this is getting tossed out. This discard, if you will be used in a recipe later today. So what I want to do is I'm leaving behind a small amount of starter in my jar. And this is what's key to making this method work. The more starter that you have in a jar and that you're storing or using means you have to have larger amounts of flour in order to feed that much of the starter, so the lactobacillus bacteria and yeast that you've got in your starter. So by keeping a much smaller amount, this is just to inoculate this next round that we're going to be doing. Now, I'm going to be baking bread tomorrow, so I'm just getting my starter ready to go. So I've got probably about a couple of tablespoons in here, and really, it doesn't matter. You just need a small amount. So we are going to take our flour. So I'm going to take a 1/4 cup of flour. And then I've got some warm water here, and I'm just using enough warm water so that all of this flour gets completely hydrated, so I don't have any dry flour, and that it's enough that I can mix it together. So I've got my little stir stick here, and I'm just going to scrape down the sides of the jar, and I'm just going to incorporate that. And this is basically what we're doing if you come from the world of sourdough. This is basically called a pre-ferment, but I'm just using the same jar. So I've only got a 1/4 cup of flour in here and a few tablespoons. So I'm going to let this go until it becomes active. And then tonight I will feed this another amount of flour and water to equal however much I need for my baking. So tomorrow I'm just going to bake 1 loaf of sourdough bread, so I'm only going to need a cup of active sourdough starter. So then tonight I will feed this about a 1/2 cup of flour and then enough water added together. That will give me a cup of sourdough starter that will be nice and active tomorrow morning when I go to make my dough. And then I will simply feed this and then put it right back in the fridge, and it will sit there and be ready for me to go until I have my next baking day. Now, as I shared, this really only works if you've got an established sourdough starter. So an established sourdough starter, there's a few things that you can know if your sourdough starter is truly established. So if you have started one from scratch, usually it's about 3 to 4 weeks before it's truly mature, and you'll be able to put it in the fridge and then bring it out and use this method. Some of the other signs are going to be, is it doubling within about 4 hours after being fed? And it has to be doubling on a very reliable basis. So when you have an immature sourdough starter, it'll go through different phases, and sometimes it'll be really active and bubble, and you're like, oh my gosh, like it's more than doubling, especially usually around like between days 3 and 5 when you're first starting a sourdough starter. That will often happen. But then as it's becoming established with the lactobacillus bacteria and the yeast, it'll go through some different phases where it kind of goes more back into dormancy. And it's just because all of those lovely live organisms and cultures that are happening in your sourdough starter, they're taking a while to figure out what is the correct balance when it's young and it's immature. So that's why I said it has to be doubling on a reliable, very consistent basis. And usually for most kitchens, that happens around the 3 to 4 week mark. Now, I am going to be doing on January 27th a live sourdough class, and I highly recommend that you take that. It's going to be a lot of fun. You'll see the link beneath this video description, but we will be going through how to start a starter, how to revive a starter, and the systems that I use to make sure that your sourdough starter is producing bread that rises, how you affect the flavor. The way that you feed your sourdough starter definitely affects the flavor that you have on your sourdough bread. And all you need to do is simply adjust the way you're feeding it in order to get the desired result, depending on where your sourdough starter is at, or start out from the get-go, and then you'll be creating a sourdough starter that will give you the exact results that you want. So you'll see that video link below, and I hope to see you in the live class.